When Ethelred took the throne of Wessex, much of England was under threat from the Vikings. During this period, the Vikings, known as the Great Heathen Army, began to invade England with a large force. Vikings, based in various places like Jutland, Norway, Svealand, Gotland, and Iceland, were continuously raiding the island. They first landed in England in 793 at the Lindisfarne Monastery. This event is considered the beginning of the Viking Age. The Vikings killed many monks and looted the monastery, spreading terror across the island. The Great Heathen Army made landfall in England in 865, and within a few years, they conquered most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This army consisted primarily of Vikings from Denmark, and its leaders included notable Viking commanders such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba Ragnarsson. The army's goal was not only to raid, but also to seize permanent lands and establish settlements in these regions. When the Vikings first arrived in East Anglia, King Edmund of East Anglia, realizing that he could not resist this great army, preferred to make peace with the Vikings and paid them a large tribute. After accepting this tribute, Halfdan Ragnarsson decided not to attack East Anglia and instead turned their attention to Northumbria and Mercia. The first major target of the Great Viking Army was the Kingdom of Northumbria. This kingdom was located in the north of England, and its capital was York. In 866, the Vikings launched a sudden attack on York, the capital of Northumbria. At that time, the Kingdom of Northumbria was embroiled in internal conflicts. King Osberht and Ella were fighting a civil war. Taking advantage of this situation, the Vikings quickly captured York. Osberht and Ella stopped fighting each other and formed an alliance, joining forces to try to retake the city from the Vikings. But this attack failed. Both kings were killed in the battle, and thus Northumbria fell under Viking control. The Vikings incorporated Northumbria into the region known as Danelaw and established a Viking kingdom there under the name Jorvik. The Viking army, now moving southward, set its sights on Mercia. In 868, the Vikings captured Nottingham, one of Mercia's important cities. This event significantly weakened Mercia. King Burgred sought help from Wessex King Ethelred and Alfred. The assistance from Wessex led to a peace agreement with the Vikings. In 869, the Vikings returned to attack East Anglia, which they had previously subjected to tribute. King Edmund decided to fight against them, but he was defeated in this battle. Edmund was captured and killed. East Anglia was now conquered by the Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Viking settlers began to gradually move into the area. The region became part of Danelaw, and they started farming and establishing villages there. In 870-871, the Vikings turned their attention to the Kingdom of Wessex. Unlike the other kingdoms, Wessex was able to resist the Vikings. The conflicts that began in Reading in 871 and continued with battles at Ashdown, Basing, and Meerton marked the beginning of Wessex's resistance against the heathen army. The Great Viking Army attacked Reading in December 870 and began using it as a base. After capturing Reading, they launched raids on the surrounding areas. King Ethelred of Wessex and his brother Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great, faced their first major clashes with the Vikings at Reading. The Anglo-Saxon army marched to attack them at Reading, but the forces they faced were larger, and the Vikings managed to repel them. Ethelred gathered his army to deal with the Halfdan Ragnarsson and played a critical role in the defense of Wessex. However, the number and strength of the Vikings continuously put the Wessex army under pressure. The most challenging year of Ethelred's reign was 871. This year went down in history as the year of battles, because a series of major battles took place between Wessex and the Vikings. The Battle of Ashdown, which took place in January 871, was one of the most important battles during Ethelred's reign. As the Vikings advanced into Wessex territory in Berkshire, Ethelred and his brother Alfred gathered a large army to stop them. Ashdown was the site of this great clash between the two armies. At the beginning of the battle, Ethelred was busy completing religious rituals to prepare his army for the fight, and he was occupied with prayers. Meanwhile, Alfred saw the situation and, realizing the enemy was rapidly approaching, took command of the front lines and engaged in battle. Alfred led his army in a bold attack against the Vikings. This lifted the morale of the Wessex army and helped them rout the Vikings. The battle ended in an important victory for the Anglo-Saxons. The Vikings, who had not faced such a defeat since their arrival on the island, suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat. This victory demonstrated Alfred's leadership abilities and earned him the respect of his people and army, signaling that he would become a significant figure as the future king of Wessex. However, this victory provided only short-term relief. The Vikings soon recovered and regrouped to launch new attacks on Wessex territory. After the Battle of Ashdown, the Vikings launched further attacks against Wessex. In the Battle of Basing, the heathen army succeeded in defeating the Anglo-Saxon army, dealing a demoralizing blow to Wessex. The Battle of Edington was another major clash with the Vikings, and the Anglo-Saxons suffered significant losses in this battle as well. During the Battle of Edington, Ethelred was severely wounded, weakened by the constant clashes with the Vikings. Ethelred died a few weeks after the battle, in April 871. His death left the leadership of Wessex in a difficult position, as the Viking threat was still looming large. Alfred the Great ascended the Wessex throne in 871, after the death of his brother Ethelred, at a time when the country was in a dire and dangerous situation. Viking attacks had intensified, and there was no unity among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The heathen army had been intensely invading England since 865, and they had either conquered or severely weakened most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Wessex was the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom resisting against them. But the Wessex army was also exhausted from the continuous attacks, and resources were running low. After ascending the throne, Alfred realized that if things continued as they were, no progress could be made against the Vikings. He needed to implement drastic changes. He particularly wanted to completely overhaul the military system. So, Alfred first created a militia system called the Fyrd to make his army more organized and effective. In the old system, the army consisted of volunteer soldiers who were gathered for short campaigns. Alfred reorganized this system and began to recruit a certain number of soldiers from each region to keep his army in a constant state of readiness. This ensured that the army was always prepared for defense and made it possible to respond more quickly to Viking attacks. Next, Alfred constructed fortified towns and castles at strategic points. These structures were called burhs and served as local defense lines against Viking attacks. The burhs became important centers both militarily and economically. Alfred connected these defense lines to each other, ensuring that every corner of the country could be defended quickly. At the same time, these towns provided safe havens for the local population and contributed to the revival of the local economy. He also strengthened the navy to provide a more effective defense against Viking attacks by sea. At that time, seafaring was not well developed in England, but Alfred invested in this area and established England's first true navy. He had new ships built, which were larger and faster than the ships used by the Vikings. This allowed for successful naval engagements against them ships in rivers and along the coast. In 871, the Viking army, led by Halfdan Ragnarsson, advanced towards Wilton. Alfred's army also marched towards this point to confront them. This battle resulted in another major defeat for the Wessex army. After the Battle of Wilton, Alfred was forced to make peace with the Halfdan Ragnarsson. This peace required Wessex to pay a large amount of tribute to the Vikings, but it allowed Alfred to temporarily protect the Kingdom of Wessex from their attacks. In 877, the Guthrum launched a major attack on Wessex. This attack posed a great danger to the Kingdom of Wessex, because the Vikings had now reached the heart of Wessex. Alfred was forced to retreat in the face of these Viking attacks and took refuge in the marshes of Athelney in Somerset. Athelney became the center of Alfred's resistance movement. There, he secretly gathered his forces, brought together his loyal warriors and devised a strategic plan. He prepared for a final assault against the Vikings. By the beginning of 878, much of Wessex was under Viking control, and Alfred decided to take a great risk to reclaim his kingdom. While at Athelney, he reorganized his army and strengthened Wessex's defense lines. With the support of the people, Alfred was able to build a strong army to fight against the Guthrum. In May 878, Alfred decided to launch a counterattack against the Vikings. Alfred gathered his army, left Athelney, and marched towards Edington, where the heathen army were stationed. He carefully organized his forces and launched a sudden and powerful attack on the Vikings. Alfred's army marched resolutely towards the Vikings and cornered them on the battlefield. Despite their numerical superiority, the Vikings struggled to hold their ground against Alfred's forces. Under the organized assaults of the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings began to weaken and were forced to retreat. Thanks to Alfred's leadership and the determination of the Anglo-Saxons, Wessex achieved a great victory in this battle. The Vikings, suffering heavy losses, were forced to retreat. This victory halted the Viking expansion in England and preserved the independence of Wessex. After the battle, Viking leader Guthrum surrendered to Alfred. Guthrum accepted the peace agreement with Alfred and agreed to convert to Christianity. Guthrum's acceptance of Christianity strengthened Alfred's authority and increased his pressure on the Vikings. After the victory at Edington, a peace treaty was made between Alfred and Guthrum, establishing the boundaries of the Danelaw region. This agreement left parts of East Anglia and Mercia under Viking control, but Wessex and Western Mercia remained under Alfred's control. After the battle, Alfred turned inward to strengthen his army, navy, and the Boer system he had established. He also sought to create a solid society by implementing reforms in social, economic, and educational fields. He created a legal code known as dooms. These laws combined Anglo-Saxon traditions with Christian morality and ensured that justice was applied fairly and correctly among the people. Among Alfred's cultural reforms, the most important was the initiation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This chronicle was a series of annual records that documented the history of England and became one of the most important sources of Alfred's reign. Additionally, Alfred translated significant religious and historical texts into Old English and authored some works himself. Believing that he had implemented enough internal reforms, Alfred decided to go on a campaign with his strengthened army. In 886, Alfred succeeded in recapturing London from the Vikings. London had been occupied and largely destroyed by them. Alfred rebuilt the city and made it a strategic defense point. The reconstruction of London was a great success both militarily and commercially, and the city's return to Wessex control further solidified Alfred's power, instilling fear in his enemies. During this period, Alfred was physically challenged by recurring chronic illnesses. It is known that Alfred had suffered from a chronic health issue in earlier periods, but the exact nature of this ailment is unclear. Some suggest he may have suffered from a chronic intestinal disease, such as Crohn's disease or hemorrhoids. This illness physically challenged Alfred throughout his life, and at times hindered his ability to perform his duties as king. Alfred the Great died on October 26, 899. Although the exact location of his death is not certain, it is widely accepted that he died in Winchester. Alfred the Great is regarded as one of the greatest kings in English history, and his style of governance left a lasting impact on the development of the English monarchy. The realization of the dream of a greater England was now left to his son, Edward the Elder.